The evening at the mansion began like any other, quiet, polished, and filled with the soft hum of expensive comfort. The air smelled faintly of fresh jasmine, drifting in from the courtyard, mixed with the sharper scent of polished marble floors. Every room glowed under warm golden lights, carefully arranged to create an atmosphere of elegance for the guests arriving that night. Among the people moving around to prepare the space was Lena, the maid who often moved so quietly that many guests never even noticed her presence. She had a way of working that made it seem as though she was invisible, slipping from room to room with a calm, gentle energy, always keeping her head low and her steps light. She did not like drawing attention. It made her feel unsafe, as if the wrong glance or the wrong word could undo the delicate balance of her life. In this foreign land, as she wiped down the long wooden table near the living room, she could hear the low voices of the mansion's owner, the wealthy man known for his grand lifestyle and bold personality. He was used to commanding attention and believed that everything in his home, including the people, existed to serve that image. His laughter carried easily across rooms, confident and loud, always making sure it landed where he wanted it. Guests began drifting in, men dressed in fine suits and women wrapped in glittering dresses. They all seemed familiar with the environment, exchanging greetings, gentle smiles, and small stories about business trips, summer homes, or luxury cars. The sound of glass clinking filled the space, along with soft background music that came from hidden speakers. It was the type of gathering where everything appeared smooth and perfect on the surface. But underneath that shine, Lena knew how quickly the atmosphere could shift. She had seen enough late-night gatherings to understand the thin line between entertainment and mockery. She moved carefully, trying to finish her tasks without catching anyone's attention, especially the attention of the man hosting the event. He liked making jokes whenever he noticed the staff walking by, small, arrogant remarks that made others laugh but left the workers feeling small. She tried to stay quiet and focused, but life has a strange way of pulling people into moments they never expect. As she passed near the grand piano, a beautifully polished instrument placed right in the center of the living room, she felt something strange, almost like a tug inside her. She avoided looking at the piano too long. It reminded her too much of a life she had once imagined for herself, a life that now felt far away. She kept her eyes on the floor, carrying a tray of empty glasses toward the kitchen when the mansion's owner suddenly noticed her. He was seated comfortably among his guests, leaning back with an amused expression as he watched people chatter on him. The moment his eyes landed on Lena, a playful smirk appeared on his face, one that the staff had come to recognize all too well. "Hey, you," he called out, lifting his hand slightly as if he were summoning a pet. His voice was loud enough for several guests to turn their heads. Lena froze. She didn't like attention, especially not in a room full of strangers. She slowly turned toward him, holding the tray close to her chest. "Yes, sir?" she asked softly. "You're always walking around so quietly," he said with a laugh. "Come here for a moment." Her heart dropped, but she obeyed, taking small steps until she stood in front of him. The guests looked at her curiously, some with mild interest, others with thin smiles that hinted at amusement. She could already sense the direction this was heading, but she kept her face calm, hoping the moment would pass quickly. He pointed toward the piano, tapping his finger against the armrest of his chair in a playful rhythm. "Tell me, do you know how to play?" For a moment, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. Lena felt her face warm as she glanced at the piano, then back at him. She didn't want to answer honestly. Too many memories sat behind those simple words, but she also couldn't lie. It might be considered disrespectful. She shook her head gently. "I'm not a musician, sir," she said carefully. He chuckled. "Oh, come on. Everyone knows a little something. Besides, it'll be fun." Then he leaned forward, his grin widening. "Go on. Play us something." A few guests exchanged amused glances. Some smiled politely, others looked uncomfortable but said nothing. It was easier to follow the flow of the night than question the host's behavior. Lena felt the weight of every stare in the room pressing against her. She held the tray a little tighter. "Sir, I don't think it's a good idea." He waved his hand as if brushing aside her concern. "Nonsense. We're all friends here. Just play a few notes. It doesn't matter what." The pressure rose in her chest. She searched the faces around the room for any sign of kindness, any hint that someone might intervene or give her an escape. But no one spoke up. They simply waited to see what she would do, some curious, others amused. She felt trapped. She could not refuse a direct request. Workers like her lived in a fragile environment. One complaint One moment of perceived disrespect, and everything could change. She had seen co-workers sent back home with no warning because of small misunderstandings. Taking a deep breath, she forced herself to remain steady. She placed the tray aside on a small counter and walked toward the piano. Her steps felt heavy, as though her body was moving without her permission. All the while, she could hear soft whispers behind her, some encouraging, some mocking, some simply entertained by the situation. The grand piano looked more magnificent up close. It gleamed under the soft light of the chandeliers, its surface smooth enough to reflect her face. She touched the edge lightly, feeling a strange mixture of fear and longing. It had been years since her hands had rested on a piano, years since she had allowed herself to imagine that she belonged anywhere near one. She sat carefully on the bench, making sure not to scratch the polished wood. Her heart was pounding so loudly she wondered if the entire room could hear it. Behind her, the guests fell silent, waiting for the moment to unfold. She placed her hands on her lap and closed her eyes briefly, steadying her breath. She wished not for applause or recognition, but simply for the moment to pass without humiliation. She feared hitting the wrong note. She feared laughter. She feared disappointing the man who had given her the command. But above all, she feared the feeling rising inside her, the old, buried part of her that still remembered what it felt like to make music. When she finally lifted her hands and placed them gently over the keys, her fingers trembled. The first touch sent a familiar chill down her spine, awakening a memory she had tried so hard to lock away. Behind her, one of the guests whispered, "This should be interesting." Another chuckled quietly. She could sense the mansion's owner leaning forward, clearly expecting her to fumble, to hit a wrong note, to create a moment he could turn into a joke. He had no idea what this piano meant to her or the life she had once dreamed of living. Her fingers hovered slightly above the keys. She swallowed hard, feeling a lump form in her throat. She knew she had to play something, anything, even a random note would satisfy them, she thought. But when her fingers finally pressed down, the sound that came out wasn't random. It wasn't forced. It wasn't clumsy. It was soft, smooth, almost too gentle to match the weight in her chest. A single note drifted through the room like a whisper. The guests went quiet. She pressed another key, then another. Each sound carried a strange mix of hesitation and familiarity, like someone taking their first steps after years of being unable to walk. Her fingers began to move slowly, almost shyly, as she formed a simple pattern of notes she had learned long ago, a melody she had practiced as a child on a much older, much less beautiful piano. The room remained silent, the earlier laughter fading into something that felt more like surprise. But Lena didn't notice any of that. In that moment, it was as if the room had disappeared. The guests, the mansion, the pressure, all of it faded behind the sound of the keys. Her fingers remembered more than she expected. They moved with a natural rhythm she thought she'd forgotten. With every note, a little more of her fear melted away. Behind her, the mansion's owner slowly lowered the glass he had been holding. His amused expression softened just slightly, replaced by a flicker of confusion. This wasn't what he expected. Not at all. Lena kept her eyes down, focused on the keys. She wasn't playing to impress anyone. She wasn't playing to defend herself. She wasn't even playing because she wanted to. She was simply responding to something deep inside her, the part of her that had lived in silence for too long. When she finally lifted her fingers from the keys, the last note lingered delicately in the air before fading into the room's stillness. No one spoke at first. Then one guest let out a soft, surprised exhale. Another shifted uncomfortably in their seat. Someone near the back murmured, "I didn't expect that." But the mansion's owner, he just stared at her, his expression unreadable. Lena kept her hands folded tightly in her lap, unsure whether she had made a terrible mistake or somehow escaped disaster. Her heart still raced, and she didn't dare look anyone in the eyes. She had only played a few notes, a simple melody, nothing grand or dramatic. But something had changed in the room, something none of them understood yet, and something even Lena could not fully explain. For several seconds after Lena lifted her hands from the keys, the room stayed strangely quiet. It wasn't the kind of silence that came from boredom or confusion. It was the kind that came when people didn't quite know how to react. The soft notes she had played still seemed to hang in the air, as if the piano itself wanted to hold on to them a little longer. Lena stayed seated on the bench, her fingers curled tightly together in her lap. She didn't dare look behind her. She could feel her heartbeat echoing inside her chest, and her palms were damp from anxiety. She wondered whether she would be scolded for playing. She wondered if she had done too much or too little. She had only meant to follow the command and make the moment pass without trouble. Finally, after what felt like a long silence, someone shifted in their seat. A soft cough broke the stillness. Then another guest exhaled sharply, as if realizing they had been holding their breath. The mansion's owner was the first to speak, though his voice was much softer than before. "You didn't say you could play," he said, not quite teasing, not quite accusing, just surprised. Lena lowered her gaze even more. "I am sorry, sir," she whispered. "I only remembered a simple tune." "Simple?" a woman among the guests said with a short laugh. "It didn't sound simple." Another guest leaned forward slightly. "Where did you learn that?" he asked with genuine curiosity. Lena hesitated, unsure how much she should say. She didn't like talking about herself. It always felt uncomfortable, as if she were stepping out of her place. She shook her head lightly. "Just from when I was younger," she replied quietly. The guests exchanged glances, some intrigued, some confused, some clearly trying to understand who this quiet maid really was. And at the center of it all, the mansion's owner stared at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. It wasn't his usual playful smirk or confident grin. It was something closer to curiosity, maybe even disbelief. He looked at her hands, then at the piano, then back at her. For a moment, he seemed lost in thought, as if trying to make sense of something that didn't fit the picture he had formed in his mind. Before he could say anything else, Lena rose from the bench. She knew she should not stay longer than necessary. She bowed her head politely and said, "May I return to my work, sir?" That seemed to wake him from his thoughts. He blinked, then waved his hand lightly. Yes, go ahead." His voice sounded distracted, almost distant. Lena stepped away from the piano and walked back toward the side counter, where she had placed the tray earlier. Her steps felt unsteady at first, as if her legs had forgotten how to carry her. Her heart was still pounding, though now it wasn't from fear, it was from the leftover emotions stirred up by the piano itself. She picked up the tray again and slipped quietly toward the kitchen, feeling dozens of eyes follow her as she moved. The guests didn't say anything harsh or unkind. They simply watched her with expressions she couldn't read. Once she reached the kitchen, she leaned against the counter and took a deep breath. The kitchen staff looked at her curiously, wondering why she seemed shaken. But Lena simply forced a small smile and continued cleaning glasses and arranging dishes. She didn't want to talk about it. Talking made things real, and she wasn't ready for that. She tried to keep working like everything was normal. But inside her mind, memories had started rushing back, the kind she had hidden for years. She remembered being a young girl sitting in front of an old upright piano in her small childhood home. The instrument had missing keys and a few broken strings, but it had been the most precious thing her family owned. Her father used to say that music gave people hope. Her mother always encouraged her to practice, even when chores piled up or money was tight. Lena remembered spending evenings learning simple melodies from an old music book, her fingers stumbling at first, then slowly growing more confident. She remembered how her parents used to smile when she played, as if the music helped them forget the hardships of life, even for a few minutes. But life had changed. Her father got sick. Bills grew heavier. Everything around her seemed to fall apart at once. The piano became a luxury they couldn't afford to focus on. And eventually, Lena had left home to work abroad, hoping to support her family and ease their financial burden. She had packed her belongings into a small bag, leaving behind the piano, the music books, and the quiet dreams she once held close. She told herself that dreams were for people who had time and comfort. She had neither. Survival came first. So she locked that part of herself away. And for years, she didn't touch a piano. Not once, not even when she walked past the one in the mansion during cleaning. She always turned her eyes away. She didn't want to feel the pain of remembering what she had lost. But tonight, the moment her fingers touched the keys, everything came rushing back, the sound, the memories, the small comfort she used to feel when playing. She hadn't expected that. She hadn't prepared for it. And now she was left feeling both exposed and strangely alive. While she tried to steady herself, the guests in the living room began whispering again. She could faintly hear their voices through the kitchen doorway. "How long has she been working here? I had no idea she had talent. She really played beautifully. Did you see her hands? So calm. Do you think she was hiding it?" What a surprise. Their voices weren't mocking this time. They sounded impressed, curious, almost fascinated. But even that attention made Lena uncomfortable. She didn't want people to talk about her. She didn't want others to expect anything from her. Expectations led to pressure, and pressure led to disappointment. She had lived long enough to understand that staying quiet and unnoticed was the safest path. But the fate of her quiet path had changed the second the piano keys sounded beneath her hands. A few minutes later, the mansion's owner stepped into the kitchen. The staff straightened up immediately when they saw him walk, and they always did. His presence had a way of making everyone nervous, not because he was harsh, but because he had power, and power always carried weight. He looked around the kitchen until his eyes found Lena. She froze for a moment, unsure whether she had done something wrong. "You," he said simply, motioning for her to come forward. She put down the dish she was holding and walked carefully toward him. "Yes, sir." He studied her for a moment. His expression was difficult to read, not angry, not amused, just serious in a way she wasn't used to seeing. "How long have you known how to play?" he asked. She hesitated. "Since I was small." He nodded slowly, as if trying to understand a bigger picture. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" She lowered her gaze. "It wasn't important, sir." "Not important?" he repeated, raising an eyebrow. "You surprised an entire room." She swallowed, unsure how to respond. "I'm here to work, sir, not to play." He crossed his arms lightly, still studying her. "Your hands didn't look like they forgot anything." Lena didn't know whether he meant it as a compliment or a warning. She forced a small, polite smile. "Thank you, sir." He looked at her for another long moment, then finally nodded. "All right," he said. "You can go back to your tasks." She bowed her head again and returned to the sink. But her hands weren't steady anymore. Her mind kept replaying the moment, his voice, his expression, and the strange tone he used. It wasn't mockery. It wasn't command. It was curiosity, maybe even respect. And that scared her more than the teasing had. The rest of the night continued with quiet conversation in the living room. The guests didn't ask her to play again, but every now and then Lena could feel their eyes drift toward the kitchen door, as if hoping she might appear again. She made sure to stay busy, keeping herself out of their line of sight. Still, the strange shift in the atmosphere lingered. Even the mansion's owner was more thoughtful than usual. He spoke softly, laughed less, and seemed distracted. Something about the look on his face told Lena that the change had begun, one she never planned for and wasn't prepared to face. When the gathering finally ended and the guests left, Lena stayed behind to clean the living room. The piano sat silently in the center, its black surface shining under the warm lights. She walked past it slowly, her eyes catching the reflection of the keys. She paused for a moment. She imagined sitting there again, not as a maid forced into a moment, but as a person who loved music, someone who used to believe she could be more, someone who once dreamed. But dreams were dangerous. They made you hope, and hope made you vulnerable. She stepped away and continued her work, pretending she hadn't paused at all. Yet deep inside, something had stirred awake, something she thought she had buried forever, and it wasn't going to fall silent so easily. The next morning arrived quietly, with sunlight slowly spilling through the tall windows of the mansion. The world outside the large house was already awake, birds calling from the garden trees, cars passing along the distant road, and workers starting their early routines. But inside the mansion, the atmosphere felt different, almost heavier than usual, as if something had shifted in the walls themselves. Lena woke before the sun, like she always did. She tied her hair back neatly, put on her uniform, and made her way through the empty hallways with her usual calm steps. Yet her mind wasn't calm at all. Every time she closed her eyes, she could hear the sound of the piano from the night before, echoing softly in her thoughts. She wished she could forget it, brush it away like dust on a shelf, but the memory stayed. She kept telling herself it was nothing, just a moment, a small accident, a request she had to obey. But deep down she knew it was more than that. She could still feel the keys beneath her fingertips, the familiar vibration, the strange warmth that spread through her chest when she played even those few simple notes. It frightened her a little, because she didn't want to want something she couldn't have. She didn't want music to make her emotional again. Her first task for the morning was to open the curtains in the living room. She walked into the large space, and her breath caught when she saw the grand piano still sitting there, silent and flawless, just as she had left it. She tried not to look at it, but her eyes drifted toward it anyway. A faint memory tugged at her parents smiling, her childhood home. The small piano that was nothing compared to this one, but still filled her world with meaning. She turned away quickly and focused on the curtains, pulling them aside one by one to let the sunlight in. The golden light washed over the marble floor and spread across the furniture, giving the whole room a warm glow. It should have felt peaceful, but instead it made her nervous. She felt exposed, as if the morning sun could see right through her. She continued with her morning chores, dusting the shelves, wiping the tables, arranging cushions, sweeping the corners. But even as she worked, her attention kept drifting to the piano. It sat there like a secret that refused to stay hidden. While she was folding a stack of clean cloths, she suddenly heard footsteps behind her. She turned quickly, and there stood the mansion's owner. For a moment, neither of them spoke. He looked rested but thoughtful, almost as if he had been awake early too, thinking about something important. "Good morning," he said quietly, a tone she wasn't used to hearing from him. "Good morning, sir," she replied softly, keeping her eyes lowered. He stepped into the room and looked around briefly before his gaze rested on the piano. His voice broke the silence again. "I couldn't stop thinking about last night." Lena froze slightly, unsure whether to respond. She stood perfectly still, waiting for whatever he wanted to say next. He walked over to the piano and touched the polished surface lightly with his fingertips. "When I asked you to play, I thought it would be a small joke, something harmless." He paused, as if he didn't like how the words sounded. "But you surprised me." She felt her stomach tighten. She didn't want praise. Praise meant attention, and attention meant trouble. "I didn't do anything special, sir," she said quietly. He looked at her, his expression calm but serious. "Yes, you did." She didn't know how to respond to that, so she kept silent. "I want to hear you play again," he said suddenly. Her breath caught. "Sir, I'm not in front of guests," he added, his tone gentle but firm. "Just us, just now." She shook her head slowly, feeling nervous all over again. "I don't think I should, sir. It was only yesterday. I don't want to cause any trouble." "It's no trouble," he said. "And I'm not ordering you. I'm asking." His words startled her. He rarely asked for anything. He usually commanded, expected obedience. But now his voice carried a softness she didn't recognize. Still, the request filled her with fear. Playing once was an accident she couldn't avoid, but playing again felt like crossing a line. She had drawn for herself a line that protected her from disappointment, from longing, from remembering a life she no longer belonged to. "I really don't know if it's a good idea," she whispered. He studied her for a moment, then shook his head lightly. "You're afraid," he said, not harshly, but as an observation. She lowered her eyes. "I'm not afraid, I just don't want to be noticed." "Too late," he replied gently. "You already are." The words made her heart sink. She wished she could go back to being invisible. Invisible was safe. Invisible meant no one expected anything from her. But now she felt caught in a spotlight she never asked for. He stepped away from the piano and walked toward her slowly, his expression still thoughtful. "When you played last night, there was something in your music, something honest, something real. It wasn't the notes, those were simple, but the feeling behind them. It was beautiful." Lena felt her face warm with embarrassment. No one had talked about her playing in years. She didn't know how to handle it. She didn't know how to accept it. "I have heard many musicians play in my life," he continued. "Some very famous, some very skilled, but none of them ever played with the kind of emotion you showed in just a few seconds. That's why I want to hear you play again." His sincerity made her even more uncomfortable. She didn't want to be special. She didn't want to be seen. She only wanted to work quietly and keep her life simple. Her voice trembled slightly as she spoke. "Sir, music is something I left a long time ago." "Why?" he asked gently. She swallowed hard. "Because life changed. That doesn't mean you have to leave your talent behind," he replied. She shook her head. "Some things are not meant for people like me anymore." He looked at her thoughtfully. "Who told you that?" The question hit her harder than she expected. She felt a tightness in her chest and old pain, a memory of all the things she had given up. She didn't know how to answer, so she kept silent. He sighed softly, not in frustration, but in understanding. "All right," he said. "I won't force you, but I want you to know something." She looked up slightly, only enough to meet his gaze for a moment. "You have a gift," he said, "and gifts don't disappear just because life becomes difficult. Sometimes they hide, sometimes they wait, but they don't leave you." His words lingered in the air like gentle echoes. Before she could respond, the doorbell rang, and he turned toward the hallway. "I have a meeting," he said quietly. "We'll talk later." He left the room, and Lena let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. The moment felt heavy, too heavy, and she didn't know what to do with all the feelings inside her. She returned to her cleaning, moving slowly, her mind drifting again and again to the piano. She hated how her heart reacted just thinking about it. She hated that a few simple notes could open old wounds. But at the same time, a part of her felt alive in a way she hadn't felt in years. She finished her tasks for the morning and moved to the courtyard to water the plants. The fresh air helped calm her, but her thoughts kept returning to the same place. The piano, the music, the unexpected attention. She wondered what her parents would say if they could see her now standing in a mansion, far from home, caught between fear and possibility. She wondered if they would tell her to play again. She wondered if they would smile the way they used to when she practiced. That thought alone made her chest tighten. The day passed slowly, filled with chores and quiet moments. Every time she walked past the living room, her eyes flicked toward the piano, but she turned away quickly, refusing to let herself get pulled in. But life has a way of repeating moments, especially the ones we try to avoid. In the early afternoon, when the house grew quiet again, she walked by the living room just as the mansion's owner stepped inside. He saw her immediately, as if he had been waiting again. Their eyes met. Again, the piano sat beside them like a silent witness, and again, something unspoken hung in the air, something that suggested the story between them was only beginning. The afternoon sunlight softened the edges of the living room, giving the space a calm warmth that made every detail feel gentle and quiet. Lena stepped slowly into the room, holding a small cloth and a bottle of polish, thinking she would just dust the shelves and leave quickly. She didn't want another conversation like the one earlier. She didn't want to talk about music or talent or anything close to her past. She only wanted to finish her work and move on. But the moment she entered, she saw him. The mansion's owner stood near the center of the room with his back half turned toward her. His hands were in his pockets, and his eyes were fixed on the piano as if the instrument itself was speaking to him. The silence in the room felt heavier than usual, but not in a frightening way, more in a thoughtful, waiting kind of way. He turned slightly when he heard her footsteps and gave a small nod, almost as if he had been expecting her. Lena felt uneasy. She wished she could turn around and leave, but he didn't look like he planned to scold her or make a request she couldn't handle. He simply looked curious. "You always come here at this time to clean," he said softly. "Yes, sir," she replied, keeping her voice calm and steady. He walked to the side of the piano and leaned gently against it, his fingers brushing the polished wood. "This room feels different since yesterday," he said thoughtfully. "Do you feel it too?" She didn't answer. She didn't want to admit anything, but he didn't seem upset by her silence. "You avoided the piano all morning," he continued quietly. "I could see it in the way you walked past. You didn't even look at it." Lina's cheeks warmed slightly. She wasn't used to being noticed so closely. "It's not something I should touch," she said softly. "I don't want to make mistakes." "What mistake?" he asked, puzzled. "Playing a few notes, bringing a room to silence, making everyone listen without even trying. That wasn't my intention," she whispered. "Sometimes the best things in life happen by accident," he replied. She didn't know what to say to that. Her eyes drifted to the floor, nervously tracing the pattern in the marble tiles. He stayed quiet for a moment, then spoke again, more gently this time. "Sit with me." Her head lifted slightly as she blinked. "Sir." He nodded toward the couch near the piano. "Just for a moment. We don't have to talk if you don't want to." She hesitated. Sitting felt unusual. Maids didn't sit with their employers unless they were told to perform some task, and sitting with him alone felt even stranger. But his tone wasn't commanding. It was patient, almost kind, and something in his eyes told her he wasn't trying to make her uncomfortable. So she walked slowly toward the couch and sat at the far end, keeping her posture straight and respectful. He sat at the opposite end, leaving a comfortable amount of space between them. The silence that followed wasn't tense. It was gentle, almost peaceful, as if the room itself encouraged them to breathe. He spoke first. "You know, when I was young, I took piano lessons too." Lena looked at him in surprise. She had never imagined that he played anything at all. He always seemed too busy, too powerful, too distracted by work and guests. "I was terrible," he admitted with a small laugh. "My instructor used to say that my fingers were too stubborn to follow a melody." Lena smiled very faintly without meaning to. It was the first tiny smile she had allowed all day. He noticed but didn't comment. Instead, he continued, "But even though I wasn't talented, I always admired those who were. People who could sit at a piano and turn silence into something beautiful. People like you." Her smile faded as quickly as it had appeared. She shook her head. "I am not like that, sir. I just remembered a few things from long ago." That's exactly what amazes me, he replied. You said you hadn't played in years, yet you played like someone who never left the instrument. She lowered her gaze again. I only followed my hands, she murmured. Your hands remember more than you think, he said gently. The words made her chest tighten with something she didn't want to feel, something like longing, possibility, or even hope. She didn't want to hope. Hope had disappointed her before. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. Can I ask you something? She nodded slowly. What made you stop playing? Her breath caught. She looked away, unable to answer right away. He didn't rush her. He simply waited, giving her time. I had to leave home, she finally whispered. Because of work? She nodded. He looked at her with quiet understanding. You sacrificed a lot. It was not a choice, she said. My family needed help. Music couldn't feed anyone. That doesn't mean it should disappear forever, he replied softly. She didn't respond. The truth was she didn't know how to face the feelings inside her. Music wasn't just something she lost. It was something she buried on purpose. Something she told herself wasn't allowed anymore. If she touched it again, really touched it, she feared it would open a place in her heart she didn't know how to close. He stood up slowly and walked toward the piano. He touched the keys but didn't press them. Just one song, he said softly. Play one song for yourself, not for me, not for anyone else. I can't, she said, her voice trembling slightly. Why not? Because. She tried to speak but the words stuck. She didn't want to let out everything she kept hidden. She didn't want to show her weakness or the emotions she had locked away. He waited, quietly patient. At last, she whispered, because if I start, I don't know if I can stop. Her honesty hung in the air like a fragile thread. He stepped back from the piano, giving her space. Then don't stop, he said softly. No one is asking you to. She closed her eyes briefly, trying to steady herself. She wasn't used to kindness. She wasn't used to someone telling her she was allowed to want something. The room went silent again, except for the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. After a few moments, she rose from the couch and walked toward the piano, not because she wanted to play, but because she needed to touch it, to understand why it held such power over her. She placed her hand gently on the glossy surface. Her fingers trembled. The touch felt both familiar and foreign, like meeting an old friend after many years. She sat slowly on the bench, her back straight, her hands resting in her lap as she stared at the keys. She didn't move them. She simply breathed, trying to gather the courage she didn't think she had. He stood nearby but kept his distance, allowing her to take her time. His silent presence didn't pressure her. Instead, it gave her a strange sense of comfort, something she hadn't felt in a long while. After what felt like several minutes, Lena lifted her hands and placed them gently on the keys. She didn't play. She just let her fingers rest there. She felt the cool smoothness of the keys, the quiet promise they carried. Her eyes watered slightly, but she blinked quickly, refusing to let tears fall. Then, slowly, she pressed one key, a soft, delicate note that floated into the room like a whisper. Another note followed, then another. Her hands moved gently, uncertain at first, then slowly growing steadier. The melody she played wasn't fancy or impressive. It was simple, like the tune a child learns before anything else. But it carried emotion, deep and raw, the kind that came from remembering something you tried so hard to forget. The mansion's owner stood silently behind her, listening with an expression that softened with every note. He didn't interrupt. He didn't speak. He simply watched a part of her come back to life. As the melody continued, Lena felt her heart loosen. She felt something warm spread through her chest, a quiet release she didn't expect. She wasn't performing. She wasn't trying to impress. She was simply playing for herself. When she finished, she lifted her hands slowly from the keys. She didn't turn around. She didn't want him to see her expression. She wasn't crying, but her eyes carried emotions she couldn't hide. He finally spoke, his voice low and sincere. Thank you. She stood up quickly, her hands still trembling, and stepped away from the piano. She tried to return to her chores, hoping to escape the heaviness in her chest. But he gently stopped her with a quiet, careful tone. You don't have to hide your talent anymore, he said softly. Not here. Not from me. She didn't look at him. She didn't know how. She simply nodded slightly and walked away with quiet steps. But inside her heart, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, something gently waking up, refusing to disappear again. And she knew, whether she liked it or not, her life had begun to change. The days after the unexpected performance felt unreal to Lena. She moved through the mansion quietly as she always did, but something had changed in the air. Instead of walking past her as if she were invisible, the guests who had witnessed her playing now paused to smile at her. Some even thanked her for the beautiful music they had heard. She wasn't used to this kind of attention, and every time someone acknowledged her, she nodded shyly and hurried away, unsure how to respond. She had spent years living in the background, moving softly so she wouldn't disturb anyone, doing her work quietly so no one would look twice. Now people were looking, and for the first time, it didn't feel threatening. It felt warm. Still, she wasn't sure what would happen next. After she finished playing the piano that night, the room had erupted in applause. She remembered the sound echoing around her like a wave. She remembered the expression on the owner's face, complete shock, mixed with something that looked almost like regret. He had approached her with a tone she had never heard from him before. He apologized to her in front of everyone. She hadn't known what to say, so she simply bowed her head and whispered, "Thank you." That had been the end of the moment, but it stayed alive in her mind. Over the next few days, the owner seemed to watch her with a thoughtful expression whenever she passed by. It wasn't his usual stare, the one filled with pride and authority. This time, he seemed like a man trying to understand something new, something he had overlooked for too long. Once, she caught him lingering by the piano, touching the keys lightly, almost as if he was replaying the memory of her performance in his thoughts. One afternoon, he invited her to speak with him privately. His voice was calm, almost gentle, and though the request made her nervous, she followed him. They walked into a quiet room where sunlight streamed through tall windows and danced across the marble floor. He asked her to sit down, which surprised her even more. She had never sat in his presence before. She felt awkward, her hands folded tightly in her lap. He asked her about her life, not in a formal way, but in a human way, as one person speaking to another. He wanted to know how long she had been playing the piano, where she had learned, and why she had stopped. Lena answered honestly. She told him about her childhood days in Manila, sitting on a wooden bench, practicing on an old upright piano her uncle had repaired just enough to work. She told him about the small music school she attended on weekends, where a kind teacher had believed in her talent. She told him about how her family had struggled financially, and how she had eventually left her country to work and support them. As she spoke, she noticed the change in the owner's face. The arrogance she once saw had softened into something else, something heavy and thoughtful. He listened carefully, not interrupting her even once. When she paused, worried about saying too much, he encouraged her to continue. She had never expected him to show this kind of interest. When she finished, the room grew quiet. He looked at her for a long moment before saying something that made her breath catch in her chest. He told her that he didn't want her to work in the mansion anymore, not as a maid. Her heart sank at first, thinking he was letting her go. But then he added that he wanted her to return to her music. He offered to support her education, to help her join a proper music program, to give her the chance to play publicly if she wished. He believed her talent was too important to be hidden behind a mop and broom. Lena stared at him, confused and overwhelmed. She wasn't sure if she had heard him correctly. All her life, she had learned not to hope too much. Hope could break a person when reality turned cruel. She stared at her hands, not knowing what to say, afraid to trust what she was hearing. But he reassured her gently, telling her that this wasn't charity. It was recognition of what she had given the world through her music. She finally found the courage to ask the question that had been growing in her heart. She asked why he was doing this for her now, when he had barely noticed her before. The owner looked uncomfortable for the first time since she had known him. He admitted that he had been wrong. He had been blinded by his lifestyle, by his pride, by the distance he kept from people who worked for him. But seeing her play had shaken something in him. Her talent had touched him in a way he couldn't ignore. It reminded him that real worth wasn't measured by status or wealth, but by the heart and dedication someone put into their passion. Lena didn't know how to respond. Tears filled her eyes, and she quickly wiped them away, embarrassed. He told her she deserved a chance to shine, and he wanted to help her take it. For the first time in a long time, Lena felt something close to hope. The next weeks became a whirlwind of change. The owner hired a music instructor, an elderly man with kind eyes and decades of experience. He visited the mansion 3 times a week to train Lena. She found herself sitting at the grand piano again, but this time not as someone forced to play or expected to entertain. She sat as a student with purpose. Her fingers remembered the music as if they had only been sleeping, waiting to be awakened. Each lesson was a journey. She practiced diligently, focusing on everything her instructor said. He taught her how to refine her technique, how to express emotion more deeply, how to control the smallest nuances of sound. He often shook his head in admiration, calling her talent rare and natural. Word of her story slowly spread, not because the owner announced it, but because guests who had witnessed her playing spoke about it with amazement. Soon, people began asking when she would play again. The owner received several requests from private gatherings, small concerts, and charity events. At first, Lena felt too nervous to agree. The idea of standing before strangers, performing confidently, seemed impossible. She worried she would disappoint everyone, but her instructor encouraged her. He reminded her that fear was just a sign that something meaningful was about to happen eventually. She agreed to perform at a small charity event hosted in a nearby cultural hall. It wasn't a huge concert, but it was her first time playing for an audience outside the mansion. The night of the event, she felt her heart racing as she stepped onto the stage. The lights were bright, the room was full, and the piano looked enormous under the spotlight. She sat down, closed her eyes for a moment, and thought of everything that had brought her here, her family back home, her childhood teacher, her uncle repairing the old piano, the owner's apology, and the silent strength she had found inside herself. Then she began to play. The music flowed like water, gentle at first, then rising with emotion. Every note carried a piece of her journey. The audience sat completely still, listening, absorbing every sound. For Lena, it felt like the world had paused just for her. She wasn't playing to prove anything. She was playing because it was who she was, who she had always been deep inside. When she finished, the room erupted in applause. She stood, trembling, and bowed. She had never felt anything like this mix of relief, joy, and disbelief. Her eyes filled with tears again, but this time she didn't wipe them away. She let them fall, letting herself feel the moment fully. After the event, people approached her with warm words and genuine admiration. They asked about her story, her journey, her plans. Some invited her to play at future events. Someone even suggested she make recordings for online platforms so more people could hear her music. Her world, once small and quiet, was opening wider than she had ever imagined. When she returned to the mansion that night, she found the owner waiting for her. He asked how the performance went, and she told him it went well, but he could see the light in her eyes and knew it meant more than that. He congratulated her, saying he had never doubted she would touch people's hearts. Over time, Lena's life transformed completely. She enrolled in a formal music program, continuing her lessons while balancing performance opportunities. She sent money home to her family, who were overjoyed to see her thriving. She stayed humble, grateful, and focused, never forgetting where she had come from. As for the owner, the experience changed him too. He became more considerate with his staff, treating them with dignity and respect. He often said that Lena had taught him more about humanity than he had learned in years of wealth and comfort. Lena eventually performed at larger venues, gaining recognition for her pure, heartfelt playing. Her story spread even further, inspiring many who had once felt invisible or underestimated. She didn't chase fame. She simply followed the path her music created for her, step by step, and through it all, she carried with her the truth she had learned, that one moment of courage, one chance taken, could reshape an entire life. She had walked into a room expecting humiliation and walked out with a future she never thought she would claim. Her music had opened hearts, including her own. In the end, she didn't just rediscover her passion, she built a legacy from it, showing that sometimes the most powerful stories begin quietly, in the lives of people the world overlooks until the right moment reveals their light.